Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your life savings, everything you worked decades to accumulate, could barely buy a loaf of bread. Not because of a stock market crash, not because of a bank failure, but because the very concept of money had been obliterated overnight. In November 1923, a German housewife needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy groceries. Children played with literal stacks of banknotes as building blocks because the paper was worthless. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day because money lost half its value by lunchtime. This wasn't fiction. This was the Weimar Republic, hyperinflation, perhaps the most catastrophic monetary collapse in modern history. And here's the disturbing part. The mechanisms that destroyed Germany's economy in 1923 haven't disappeared. They're still with us today, lurking in the shadows of every central bank decision, every fiscal stimulus package, every political promise to print our way to prosperity. So what happens when money dies? What does it do to the human psyche, to social bonds, to our fundamental understanding of value and trust? And most critically, what can this 90-year-old economic apocalypse teach us about the precarious monetary systems we depend on right now? Welcome to the Economic Philosopher, where we explore the deep currents that shape our financial world and our lives within it. Today, we're diving into one of history's most extreme economic experiments, not by choice, but by catastrophic miscalculation. The Weimar Republic hyperinflation wasn't just an economic event, it was a psychological trauma, a philosophical crisis, and a social earthquake that reshaped an entire nation's relationship with money, government, and reality itself. Understanding this period means understanding something profound about human nature, about trust, about the invisible agreements that hold civilization together. Most people know the dramatic imagery wheelbarrows of cash, wallpaper made from banknotes, the famous story of the price of bread doubling while someone waited in line. But these are just symptoms. Today, we're going deeper. We're examining the root causes, the human psychology behind the madness, the philosophical questions it raised, about the nature of value and the economic lessons that remain. Urgently relevant as nations worldwide grapple with unprecedented debt levels and monetary expansion, we'll trace this crisis from its origins in World War I, through its devastating peak in 1923, explore the profound psychological and social damage it inflicted. Examine the philosophical implications for our understanding of money and value, and extract the critical economic lessons that every person living under fiat currency today needs to understand. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Hyperinflation isn't just history, it's a recurring phenomenon. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Lebanon, Turkey. The pattern repeats because the underlying human tendencies, political expediency, monetary illusion, the temptation to print rather than face hard choices, these never go away. So let's begin where it all started, in the ashes of World War I. When Germany faced an impossible choice that would echo through generations. To understand how money can become meaningless, we need to understand how Germany found itself on this path. The story begins not in 1923, but in 1914, when Europe plunged into what would become the deadliest conflict the world had yet seen. When World War I erupted, Germany faced the colossal challenge of financing a modern industrial war. The German government made a fateful decision. Rather than significantly raising taxes, a politically unpopular move, they would finance the war primarily through borrowing and expanding the money supply. The implicit assumption was simple: Germany would win, and the defeated nations would pay for everything through reparations. This wasn't entirely irrational at the time. War financing through debt was common. But Germany took it to unprecedented levels. They abandoned the gold standard in 1914, giving their central bank the freedom to print money without the constraint of gold backing. The Reichsbank began creating marks at an accelerating pace to purchase government bonds. From 1914 to 1918, the German money supply increased nearly fourfold. Here's where the first critical lesson emerges. Inflation doesn't begin when prices rise dramatically. It begins the moment governments start financing expenditures through monetary expansion rather than real savings or taxation. The hyperinflation of 1923 had its roots in decisions made a decade earlier. When Germany lost the war in 1918, the foundation crumbled. Not only would there be no reparations flowing in from defeated enemies, but Germany itself faced enormous reparation obligations under the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty, signed in June 1919, imposed devastating terms. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to roughly $442 billion in today's money, to the Allied powers. The new Weimar Republic government, already fragile and facing political chaos, confronted an impossible situation. The economy was shattered. Industrial production had collapsed. The nation had lost territory and resources. Unemployment was rampant. Social unrest threatened revolution. And now they had to make massive payments to foreign creditors in gold or foreign currency. The government faced a choice: impose crushing taxation and austerity on an already devastated population, risking revolution and complete political collapse, or continue the wartime policy of financing obligations through the printing press. They chose the latter, or more accurately, they felt they had no choice. This is crucial to understand. Hyperinflation rarely results from simple incompetence. It typically emerges from political constraints that make printing money the least terrible option among a menu of catastrophic choices. German policymakers weren't ignorant of monetary economics. They understood that printing money caused inflation, but they faced a political calculus where other options seemed to guarantee immediate collapse. Throughout 1919 and 1920, the Reichsbank continued expanding the money supply. Inflation accelerated but remained somewhat manageable. Prices roughly doubled in 1919 and doubled again in 1920. Concerning, yes, but not yet catastrophic. Many Germans even initially benefited. Those with debt saw their obligations become easier to pay. Export businesses thrived as the weak mark made German goods cheap internationally. Workers saw nominal wages rise, even if real purchasing power declined. This created a dangerous illusion, what economists call monetary illusion, where people focus on nominal values rather than real purchasing power. When your wages double, it feels like prosperity, even if prices have tripled. This psychological phenomenon would play a crucial role in allowing the crisis to accelerate beyond the point of no return. The situation began spiraling out of control in 1921. France, frustrated by Germany's failure to meet reparation payments, occupied the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, in January 1923. The German government responded with a policy of passive resistance, essentially a general strike in the occupied territory. They continued paying striking workers and businesses with printed money. Now the feedback loop became vicious. The occupation removed Germany's primary source of industrial production and tax revenue at precisely the moment when government expenditures skyrocketed to support the resistance. The government's response was to print exponentially more money. By the summer of 1923, the Reichsbank was operating 30 paper mills around the clock and employing 150 printing companies with 2,000 printing presses to produce banknotes. The numbers become almost incomprehensible. In January 1923, $1 equaled 18,000 marks. By August, it was 1 million marks. By November, it reached 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. The monthly inflation rate in October 1923 was 29,500%. Prices doubled every few days. At the peak, prices doubled every few hours. This wasn't just economic dysfunction. This was the complete disintegration of money as a concept. When prices change so rapidly that money loses its value between the time you receive it and the time you spend it, money ceases to function as money. It no longer serves as a store of value, a unit of account, or even effectively as a medium of exchange. People's behavior adapted in increasingly desperate and bizarre ways. Workers demanded payment in goods rather than currency. Barter systems re-emerged. Some cities and businesses began issuing their own emergency currencies backed by tangible goods. People rushed to convert cash into absolutely anything with real value: furniture, china, food, foreign currency, the moment they received payment. Stories from the period read like dark satire. A woman left a basket containing millions of marks outside a shop while she went inside to purchase goods. When she came out, the basket was gone, but the money had been dumped on the street. The basket had more value than its contents. A student ordered a cup of coffee advertised at 5,000 marks. Before he finished it, the price had risen to 9,000 marks. The government responded by denominating bills in ever larger amounts. They issued million-mark notes, then billion-mark notes, then trillion-mark notes. At the peak, the largest denomination was 100 trillion marks. Collecting the physical currency to pay for something could be more challenging than earning it. The hyperinflation finally ended in November 1923 when the government introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency ostensibly backed by real estate and industrial assets. The exchange rate was 1 Rentenmark for 1 trillion old marks. But the real stabilization came from something simpler. The government finally stopped printing money to finance its operations. They balanced the budget. They imposed fiscal discipline. They restored, through these actions, something more fundamental than currency: credibility. The entire episode from 1914 to 1923 offers our first set of lessons. Wars financed through inflation rather than taxation create deferred catastrophes. Once monetary expansion begins, political pressures make it extraordinarily difficult to stop. And, perhaps most importantly, the destruction of a currency happens gradually, then suddenly first at a pace where people can almost adapt, then accelerating beyond anyone's capacity to adjust. The Weimar hyperinflation forces us to confront profound philosophical questions about the nature of money, value, and social reality itself. What happened in Germany between 1914 and 1923 wasn't merely an economic crisis, it was an ontological crisis. A collapse in shared understanding about what things are and what they mean. Let's start with the fundamental question. What is money? Most people would say money is the bills and coins issued by the government, but this definition immediately reveals its inadequacy when we examine Weimar Germany. The government was issuing more currency than ever before, printing it 24 hours a day, yet money was disappearing. How can money be simultaneously proliferating and vanishing? The philosopher Georg Simmel, writing before World War I, offered crucial insights. In his masterwork, The Philosophy of Money, Simmel argued that money is essentially crystallized social trust. Money works not because of its material properties. Paper has minimal intrinsic value, but because it represents a claim on society's productive capacity, backed by collective belief in its stability and acceptance. This understanding illuminates what really happened during Weimar hyperinflation. The physical currency wasn't disappearing, it was multiplying absurdly. What was disappearing was money's essence, that crystallized social trust, that collective belief in stable value and future acceptance. When prices doubled daily, people stopped believing the mark would hold its value even for hours. The social agreement that constituted money, as money dissolved, what remained was merely colorful paper, increasingly elaborate but increasingly meaningless. This reveals something profound. Money is a form of social technology, perhaps the most important social technology ever invented. Like language, money enables complex coordination among strangers. It allows me to accept payment for work today, confident I can exchange that payment for goods tomorrow from people who weren't involved in the original transaction. This requires trust, not personal trust in individuals, but systemic trust in the stability of value over time. Hyperinflation destroys this systemic trust, and in doing so, it damages the fundamental fabric of complex society. When money fails, we regress toward personal relationships and immediate exchange. The sophisticated division of labor that creates prosperity becomes impossible to coordinate. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who lived through this period as a young woman in Germany, later wrote extensively about how such breakdowns in shared reality enable totalitarianism. When common facts dissolve, when the value of money can change by 10,000% in a month, when yesterday's truths are today's absurdities, people lose their grip on objective reality. They become susceptible to ideologies that promise certainty, no matter how extreme. This wasn't coincidental. The generation that experienced Weimar hyperinflation became the generation susceptible to Nazi propaganda. Economic trauma created psychological vulnerability. When money becomes meaningless, when prudent saving proves worthless, while speculation and corruption thrive, when the middle class sees its life's work evaporate, while others profit from chaos, this breeds a particular kind of bitterness and rage. Now let's consider another philosophical dimension, the nature of value itself. Economists distinguish between intrinsic value and exchange value. Gold has some intrinsic value. It's useful in electronics, jewelry, dentistry. But most of gold's value is exchange value. We value it because others value it, because it can be exchanged. Fiat currency, which Germany was effectively using by 1914, has virtually no intrinsic value. It's pure exchange value, pure social construction. This isn't a weakness in normal times, it's actually an advantage. Fiat currency can expand and contract with economic needs, theoretically enabling better economic management than rigid gold standards. But Weimar revealed the terrifying flip side. When exchange value is all you have and collective belief collapses, you're left with literally nothing. The paper currency that represented life savings became overnight worthless, not because of any change in the physical currency itself, but because of a change in collective perception and trust. This raises uncomfortable questions about our current monetary systems. Every major currency today is fiat currency, backed by nothing except governmental authority and collective belief. The philosopher might ask, what's the fundamental difference between Weimar, marks, and US dollars, or euros, or yen? The economist's answer is institutional credibility and fiscal discipline. But these are fragile human constructions, not physical laws. The Weimar experience suggests that money might be better understood not as a thing, but as a relationship between big individuals and their government, between present production and future claims, between trust and authority. When those relationships break down, the physical currency becomes a hollow symbol, a promise that everyone knows won't be kept. There's also a deeper philosophical point about time and uncertainty. Money essentially represents stored, time-past labor that can be converted into future goods. When you save money, you're deferring consumption, trusting that future exchange will be possible at reasonably predictable values. Hyperinflation destroys this temporal bridge. It makes the future radically unpredictable, forcing everyone into a desperate present orientation. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about how human existence requires the ability to make meaningful connections between past, present, and future, what he called narrative identity. Hyperinflation shatters this temporal continuity. Your past work becomes meaningless, your present is chaos, your future is unplannable. This isn't just economically destructive, it's existentially disorienting. One of the most philosophically interesting aspects of the Weimar crisis was how it revealed the socially constructed nature of economic reality, while simultaneously demonstrating that social constructions have devastating real consequences. Yes, money is just a social agreement, but when that agreement collapses, people starve. The social is real, perhaps more powerfully real than the physical, because human life depends on social coordination. This leads to a final philosophical consideration: the relationship between political authority and monetary credibility. Money in modern societies is inextricably linked to state power. The government declares what counts as legal tender, enforces contracts denominated in its currency, and collects taxes in that currency. But Weimar demonstrated that this relationship isn't purely top-down. Governments can declare something as money, but they cannot force people to believe it will hold value. Authority can command compliance, but not trust. The Weimar government maintained legal authority to the N-mark-denominated contracts remained legally enforceable, but this authority became hollow when the marks themselves became worthless. This suggests that governmental monetary power is fundamentally consensual, resting on public confidence rather than pure coercion. When confidence evaporates, governmental declarations become irrelevant. People simply ignore the official currency and create alternatives: foreign currencies, barter, commodity money. The philosophical implications are profound. If money is fundamentally a confidence game, a collective belief in stability and future value, then monetary policy isn't primarily a technical exercise in managing interest rates and money supply. It's a practice of maintaining public trust through demonstrated restraint and credibility. The Weimar Republic failed this test catastrophically. They chose short-term political expediency over long-term credibility. They allowed immediate fiscal pressures to override monetary stability. And they discovered that once credibility is lost, it cannot be restored through half measures. Only radical reform, completely abandoning the old currency and committing credibly to fiscal discipline, could restore trust. This philosophical framework helps us understand not just what happened in Weimar Germany, but why it matters beyond that specific historical moment. Every fiat currency system faces the same fundamental challenge: maintaining collective belief in stability and future value. It's a balancing act between flexibility and credibility, between meeting immediate needs and maintaining long-term trust. The The human mind evolved to function in a relatively stable world where a chicken costs roughly the same today as yesterday, where money saved today can buy food tomorrow, where cause and effect follow predictable patterns. Hyperinflation violates these fundamental assumptions about reality, and the psychological consequences are devastating and long-lasting. Let's start with the individual psychological experience. Imagine you've spent 30 years working, saving responsibly, building security for yourself and your family. You have 100,000 marks in the bank, a comfortable cushion, retirement security, your children's educational fund. Within months, that 100,000 marks won't buy a loaf of bread. Your entire life's productive effort, your decades of delayed gratification, your responsible planning, all erased. Not through any fault of yours, but through forces completely beyond your control. This isn't just financial loss. This is profound psychological trauma, comparable to surviving a natural disaster or violent assault. The psychologist's term is learned helplessness, the discovery that your actions don't matter. That responsible behavior leads to ruin, while speculation and recklessness might bring survival. Thousands of personal accounts from Weimar Germany describe eerily similar psychological patterns: disorientation, depression, rage, and a frantic present orientation. People became obsessed with spending money immediately upon receiving it. The concept of saving became not just economically irrational, but psychologically impossible. How do you save when money evaporates in your hands? This created what psychologists might recognize as a form of collective PTSD. An entire society lost its ability to plan for the future, lost faith in institutions, lost trust in the possibility of stability. The psychological impacts persisted long after the economic crisis ended. Germans who lived through this period carried deep anxieties about inflation for the rest of their lives. But the psychological damage went beyond individual trauma. Hyperinflation destroyed social bonds and moral frameworks in insidious ways. Consider the psychological impact on different social classes. The wealthy, especially those with assets in foreign currencies or real property, could protect themselves or even profit from the chaos. Industrialists who owned factories, farmers who owned land, anyone with tangible assets saw their debts evaporate while their real wealth remained intact. Some actually benefited enormously. Meanwhile, the professional middle class to teachers, lawyers, doctors, civil servants, the educated backbone of society, were utterly destroyed. Their savings disappeared. Their fixed salaries became worthless. Their careful planning proved foolish, while speculation and connections to power brought wealth. This wasn't just economic inequality, though. It was certainly that. It was a psychological assault on the very concept of merit and virtue. The implicit social contract, work hard, save responsibly, play by the rules, and you'll be secure, that contract was revealed as a lie. The prudent were punished. The reckless prospered. Success became disconnected from virtue, becoming instead a matter of luck, connections, or willingness to engage in borderline criminal speculation. The psychological term for this is anomie, a breakdown in social bonds and moral frameworks when the rules that supposedly govern society are revealed as meaningless. The sociologist Emil Durkheim argued that anomie creates a particular kind of social pathology. People lose their sense of being embedded in a meaningful moral order. Everything becomes permitted because nothing makes sense. Weimar Germany in 1923 exhibited classic anomie. Crime soared. Prostitution became rampant as women turned to desperate measures for survival. Corruption exploded as officials demanded bribes in stable currency while their official salaries became worthless. Social bonds frayed as everyone focused on individual survival. There's also a fascinating psychological phenomenon that enabled the hyperinflation to accelerate beyond logical stopping points: the psychology of relative thinking and adaptation. Humans are remarkably adaptable. We adjust psychologically to changing circumstances faster than we realize. When inflation went from 5% annually to 50%, it was shocking. But after a few months of 50%, people adapted. They learned to cope. Then, when inflation hit 500%, it was again shocking, but after that became normal, it stopped being shocking. The reference point kept shifting. This adaptation created a psychological trap. At each stage, the current level of inflation became normalized, and governmental promises to control it became believable because the government was promising to return to recently normal levels even, though those recently normal levels were themselves catastrophic by historical standards. Psychologists call this shifting baselines, or the boiling frog syndrome. You don't notice gradual changes, because each step seems small relative to the current state, even though the cumulative change is enormous. By the time Germans realized that monthly inflation of 1,000% was catastrophically unsustainable, they'd already psychologically normalized monthly inflation of 100%, which itself was unsustainable. This psychological phenomenon helps explain why hyperinflations typically accelerate to absurd extremes, rather than being stopped earlier. Each stage seems manageable relative to the immediate past, even as it represents complete breakdown relative to any historical baseline. There's another psychological dimension worth exploring: trust and its destruction. Social psychologists emphasize that trust is fundamental to human cooperation and complex society. We trust strangers to honor contracts, trust institutions to follow rules, trust that money will hold value, trust that governments will protect rather than prey on citizens. Hyperinflation systematically destroys all these forms of trust. You can't trust contracts denominated in an unstable currency. You can't trust institutions that permit or cause such destruction. You can't trust government promises after those promises have been violated so egregiously. And ultimately, you can't even trust your own judgment about value and worth when prices change hourly. Psychologists have found that once trust is destroyed, it's extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. This explains why the psychological impacts of Weimar hyperinflation persisted for generations. Even after economic stability returned, Germans remained suspicious of government, anxious about inflation, and skeptical of official assurances. This deep-seated anxiety had political consequences. When the Great Depression struck in 1929 to 1933, Germans still traumatized by hyperinflation were especially vulnerable to extremist promises of stability and order. The Nazis offered simple explanations for the chaos: Jewish conspiracies, treasonous politicians, and promised authoritarian control to prevent future economic disasters. The psychological scars from hyperinflation made Germans susceptible to totalitarianism. This isn't to claim hyperinflation directly caused Nazism. The historical causation is far more complex, but it created psychological preconditions: deep distrust of democratic institutions, anxiety about economic stability, rage at the system, and desperate hunger for certainty and order at any cost. There's a final psychological insight worth noting. Hyperinflation creates a particular temporal psychology. Normal economic life requires the ability to think across time horizons, to plan, to save for the future, to invest in education or skills that pay off years later, to maintain relationships that provide security over time. Hyperinflation collapses all time horizons into the desperate present. When money loses half its value in hours, only immediate consumption is rational. Future-oriented behavior becomes literally nonsensical. You can't save for retirement. You can't plan your children's education. You can't invest in skills or relationships that might pay dividends years later. This forced present orientation has profound effects on human development and society. Young people who should be developing long-term plans and skills instead learn that only immediate gratification and survival tactics matter. The psychological habits that enable prosperity-delayed gratification, long-term planning, trust in future returns become adaptive liabilities. Understanding these psychological dimensions helps explain why hyperinflation is so destructive and why its effects persist long after economic stabilization. The damage isn't just to bank accounts, but to human psychology, social bonds, moral frameworks, and the basic cognitive and emotional capacities that enable complex civilization. Now we reach the critical question. What does Weimar teach us about economics today? Are we at risk of repeating these catastrophic mistakes? What are the warning signs? And what protections exist against hyperinflation in modern economies? Let's start with the core economic lessons. Then examine their relevance to our current situation. First fundamental lesson: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This insight, most famously articulated by economist Milton Friedman, was proven definitively by Weimar. Germany's hyperinflation resulted directly from explosive growth in the money supply. Between 1914 and 1923, the amount of marks in circulation increased by a factor of approximately 1.2 trillion. This might seem obvious, but it's frequently obscured by political narratives that blame inflation on greedy businesses, foreign enemies, supply shocks, or bad luck. While these factors can contribute to price increases, sustained high inflation requires monetary expansion. Without the printing press, Weimar's inflation would have been impossible. Second lesson, there's a critical distinction between inflation and hyperinflation. Standard inflation prices rising 2 to 5% annually can result from various factors and is generally manageable. Hyperinflation prices doubling monthly or more frequently is always a crisis of government credibility and fiscal sustainability. Hyperinflation doesn't happen because central bankers are ignorant or make technical errors in monetary policy. It happens when governments face impossible fiscal situations and choose printing money over default or politically unbearable austerity. It's fundamentally a fiscal phenomenon enabled by monetary means. Third lesson, the inflation tax is the most regressive and destructive tax possible. When governments finance operations through printing money, they're effectively taxing everyone who holds currency. Your cash holdings and fixed income assets lose purchasing power as prices rise. This inflation tax falls disproportionately on the poor and middle class, who hold more of their wealth in cash and fixed income assets, while the wealthy can protect themselves with real assets, foreign currencies, and financial sophistication. Fourth lesson, hyperinflation creates winners and losers, and the winners are typically those closest to power, those with inside information, and those with international connections. It's not a neutral phenomenon that affects everyone equally. Inflation redistributes wealth from savers to debtors, from workers to asset owners, from the powerless to the connected. Fifth lesson, there are critical feedback loops that can cause inflation to accelerate beyond control. When people lose faith in a currency's stability, they try to minimize their holdings of that currency. This increased velocity of money, how quickly money circulates, effectively multiplies the money supply's inflationary impact. People also demand higher wages to compensate for expected inflation. Businesses raise prices preemptively, and these expectations become self-fulfilling, creating an inflationary spiral. Sixth lesson, the only way to stop hyperinflation is through credible commitment to fiscal and monetary discipline. Half measures don't work. Germany tried gradual reforms throughout 1923, and all failed. Only when they radically reformed, introducing a new currency, balancing the budget, stopping monetary financing of deficits, did stability return. Credibility can't be rebuilt incrementally once it's thoroughly destroyed. Now, how relevant are these lessons today? Should we worry about hyperinflation in modern developed economies? The honest answer is nuanced. The probability of Weimar-style hyperinflation in countries like the United States, Eurozone, Japan, or Britain is very low, but it's not zero, and the risks are larger than many people realize. Let's consider the protections that exist today that didn't exist in Weimar Germany. Modern central banks are generally independent from direct political control. The Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and similar institutions have legal independence to resist political pressure to print money. Weimar's Reichsbank was directly subordinate to the government, forced to finance whatever the government demanded. Modern economies have more sophisticated financial systems, deeper capital markets, and greater capacity to borrow rather than print. The U.S. can finance deficits by selling bonds to global investors at relatively low interest rates, something Weimar Germany couldn't do after losing the war. Most developed nations maintain significant productive capacity, stable political systems, and institutional credibility built over decades or centuries. Weimar Germany was a brand new government born from military defeat, lacking established credibility. International monetary cooperation and institutions like the IMF provide support and oversight. That didn't exist in the 1920s. Global financial integration creates both constraints and safety valves. These protections are real and important. But let's also examine the concerning parallels and emerging risks. Debt levels in developed countries are extraordinarily high by historical standards. U.S. government debt exceeds GDP. Japan's government debt is over 250% of GDP. Many European nations carry debt loads that would have been considered unsustainable decades ago. While high debt doesn't directly cause hyperinflation, it creates fiscal pressure that could, in a crisis, push governments toward monetary financing. Central bank independence, while important, isn't absolute. Political pressure is increasing in many countries for central banks to pursue goals. Beyond price, stability financing, green energy transitions, supporting employment, funding government programs directly. The boundaries between fiscal and monetary policy are blurring. The past 15 years, since the 2008 financial crisis, have normalized unprecedented monetary expansion. Quantitative easing central banks, creating money to purchase government bonds and other assets, was once considered emergency policy. It's increasingly treated as a standard tool. The U.S. Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. This is money creation on a scale that would have been inconceivable to previous generations of economists. Modern monetary theory and similar ideas are gaining political traction, arguing that governments with sovereign currencies can't run out of money and should use monetary policy more aggressively to achieve policy goals, while mainstream economists remain skeptical. The political appeal of "we can just print more money" is obvious and dangerous. Several countries have experienced high inflation or hyperinflation in recent decades: Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, Lebanon. The mechanisms described by Weimar theory remain active in the world. Perhaps most concerning is the complacency. Many economists and policymakers have concluded that modern monetary management is so sophisticated that high inflation is essentially impossible in developed countries. This confidence is historically unusual and potentially dangerous. It echoes the pre-World War I belief that the gold standard made financial crises impossible, or the pre-2008 belief that we'd mastered macroeconomic management and ended the business cycle. There's a specific scenario worth worrying about: what economists call the fiscal dominance trap. Imagine a crisis, perhaps a severe recession, a pandemic, or a geopolitical shock that creates enormous pressure for government spending. Simultaneously, high existing debt makes traditional bond financing expensive or impossible. Political pressure mounts for the central bank to finance deficits directly by purchasing government bonds with newly created money. At first, this might work without causing inflation if the economy has excess capacity. But if this becomes standard practice, if governments come to rely on monetary financing, if debt continues growing faster than the economy, at some point inflation accelerates. Once it starts, the same feedback loops that destroyed Weimar's currency could emerge. Expectations shift, velocity increases, indexation spreads, and suddenly inflation is out of control. The transition from manageable inflation to hyperinflation can be remarkably quick. Weimar went from roughly 10% monthly inflation in late 1922 to 29,500% monthly inflation 1 year later. By the time everyone recognizes the crisis, it may be too late for gradual adjustment. What about cryptocurrencies and digital currencies as protection? This is a complicated topic. Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies are sometimes promoted as protection against inflation because their supply is limited by protocol rather than governmental discretion. There's something to this: fixed supply currencies can't be inflated away by government printing. However, cryptocurrencies face their own challenges: extreme volatility, limited acceptance, scaling problems, and the reality that governments can regulate or ban them. They might serve as a hedge or diversification, but they're not a complete solution. Central bank digital currencies, these potentially give governments even more control over the money supply and could make negative interest rates and other forms of financial repression easier to implement. The implications are unclear, but worth watching carefully. So what should individuals do to protect themselves? First, understand that moderate inflation is different from hyperinflation. Moderate inflation 2 to 5% annually is annoying but manageable through normal financial planning. Hyperinflation is a catastrophic systemic failure requiring different thinking. For protection against moderate inflation, hold diversified assets rather than cash. Real estate, stocks, commodities, and inflation-protected bonds all provide some hedge against inflation. Maintain valuable skills and human capital. Your ability to earn income adjusts with inflation over time. Avoid excessive long-term fixed-rate debt you owe in real terms, but mortgage debt at fixed rates can be advantageous if inflation rises. For protection against potential hyperinflation, hold some assets outside your domestic currency: foreign stocks, foreign real estate, foreign bank accounts. Physical precious metals like gold provide a traditional inflation hedge. Maintain tangible skills and tools. Build community connections and network social capital becomes crucial when financial capital fails. Most importantly, stay informed about fiscal and monetary policy. Pay attention to debt levels, central bank balance sheets, and government financing methods. If you see patterns emerging, persistent government deficits financed by central bank money creation, accelerating inflation, political rhetoric justifying monetary expansion, these are warning signs. The goal isn't paranoia, but prudent awareness. Hyperinflation remains a low-probability event in developed economies, but it's not impossible, and the consequences are so severe that even a small probability warrants attention and preparation. The deeper economic lesson from Weimar isn't just about protecting personal wealth. It's about understanding the fragility of monetary systems, the importance of fiscal discipline, and the catastrophic consequences when governments prioritize short-term political expediency over long-term stability. Every fiat currency that has ever existed has either ended in hyperinflation or been abandoned while still functional. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is less than 50 years. The current global monetary system, where all major currencies are fiat currencies backed by nothing except government credibilities, a historical experiment that's only for decades old, dating to the final abandonment of gold backing in 1971. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent or even likely, but it means we shouldn't be complacent. The mechanisms that destroyed Weimar's currency, political pressure for easy money, deficit financing through printing, erosion of credibility, remain possible today. Our protections are institutional and cultural, not physical laws. They're only as strong as our commitment to maintaining them. Let's pull together everything we've explored. The Weimar Republic hyperinflation was simultaneously an economic catastrophe, a psychological trauma, a philosophical crisis, and a political earthquake. Understanding it requires integrating insights across all these dimensions. The economic lesson is clear. Inflation results from monetary expansion. Hyperinflation results from fiscal crises met with monetary financing. And once credibility is lost, only radical reform can restore stability. There are no half measures, no painless solutions. The philosophical lesson is deeper. Money is crystallized social trust, and when that trust dissolves, the physical currency becomes meaningless. All fiat currencies rest on collective belief, and that belief is fragile. The social construction of economic reality is real, frighteningly real in its consequences. The psychological lesson is most haunting. Hyperinflation doesn't just destroy wealth, it destroys the human capacity for planning, trust, and moral meaning. It creates learned helplessness, anomie, and desperate present orientation. It breaks social bonds and makes society vulnerable to extremism. The historical lesson is cautionary. Catastrophic outcomes result from incremental decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation. No single German policymaker intended to create hyperinflation. Each decision to finance the war through money creation, to continue this policy, to meet reparations, to support passive resistance in the Ruhr seemed like the least bad option at the time. The catastrophe emerged from the accumulation of individually defensible choices. So, what should you do with this knowledge? First, maintain perspective. We're not on the brink of Weimar-style hyperinflation in developed economies. The risks exist but remain relatively low. Don't let this analysis lead to panic or extreme decisions. Second, stay informed about fiscal and monetary policy in your country. Understand government debt levels, how deficits are being financed, what your central bank is doing with its balance sheet. These aren't just technical matters for economists, they affect your savings, your future, your life. Third, maintain diversification. Don't keep all your wealth in cash or fixed income assets denominated in a single currency. Hold real assets, stocks, perhaps some foreign currency exposure. This isn't about doomsday prepping, it's about prudent risk management. Fourth, invest in human capital and community. Your skills, knowledge, and relationships are the most inflation-proof assets. They can't be inflated away, taxed away, or confiscated. In every crisis, including Weimar Germany, those with valuable skills and strong community ties survived better than those dependent solely on financial assets. Fifth, understand the political economy of inflation. Be skeptical of political rhetoric that promises something for nothing, that suggests we can print our way to prosperity, that dismisses inflation concerns as unnecessarily cautious. These are the same dangerous illusions that enabled Weimar's catastrophe. Sixth, advocate for fiscal responsibility and central bank independence. These are the bulwarks against hyperinflation. Political pressure for easy money, for monetary financing of government spending, for central banks to pursue goals beyond price stability, these pressures should be resisted. The deeper takeaway is about humility and vigilance. The Weimar hyperinflation teaches us that catastrophic outcomes are possible, that supposedly sophisticated economies can collapse into chaos, that the social agreements underpinning prosperity are fragile. But it also teaches us that these catastrophes aren't inevitable. They result from human choices, particularly political choices. Better choices maintained over time can prevent them. Germany itself learned these lessons. Post-World War II, West Germany developed perhaps the world's strongest institutional commitment to price stability. The Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, was given exceptional independence and a singular mandate: maintain the value of the currency. This wasn't just policy, it was cultural memory. Trauma transformed into institutional safeguards. This commitment to monetary stability served Germany extraordinarily well. When the euro was created, Germany insisted on building similar safeguards into the European Central Bank. The experience of hyperinflation, 90 years past, still shapes policy today. There's a final, more abstract takeaway. Pay attention to slow-moving catastrophes. The Weimar hyperinflation wasn't a sudden shock. It built over 9 years from 1914 to 1923, with acceleration phases that were predictable to anyone paying close attention. But at each stage, it was easy to normalize the current situation, to tell yourself that surely things would stabilize soon, to avoid the pain of serious reform. This pattern gradual deterioration that suddenly collapses into catastrophe is throughout history and across domains. Climate change follows this pattern. Political radicalization follows this pattern. Personal health follows this pattern. The challenge is recognizing when you're on such a trajectory and taking action before the crisis point. The Weimar hyperinflation is a case study in failure to act soon enough. German policymakers understood inflation was a problem throughout the early 1920s. They tried various minor reforms. They promised fiscal discipline. They hoped for external salvation. But they avoided the genuinely painful steps: radically cutting spending, raising taxes, defaulting on obligations, until the catastrophe was complete. Only after total collapse did they find the political will for real reform. Don't wait for complete collapse before taking action. Whether in public policy or personal finance, address problems while they're manageable rather than waiting for crisis. So here's what I want you to do. Take a moment after this video to think about your own financial situation, your assumptions about money and stability, your preparedness for economic disruption. Then I want you to leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most about the Weimar hyperinflation. Does any aspect of current fiscal or monetary policy concern you? What are you doing to protect yourself against inflation or economic instability? Let's have a real conversation about these issues. This isn't theoretical history, these are urgent questions about our economic future. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe to the Economic Philosopher. We dive deep into the economic forces shaping our world, always with an eye toward history, philosophy, and psychology, the human dimensions that mainstream economics often ignores. Check out the videos I'm linking on screen. One examines the psychology of money more broadly, exploring why we make irrational financial decisions. The other looks at modern monetary theory and whether governments really can print money without consequences. Both will deepen your understanding of these critical issues. Share this video with anyone who thinks money is boring or economics doesn't matter. Weimar Germany proved that economic policy can destroy lives as surely as war. These aren't abstract questions. They're about the stability of our savings, the security of our futures, the possibility of maintaining civilized society. This is the Economic Philosopher, where we explore the deep currents shaping our financial world. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, those who forget economic history are condemned to repeat it, usually at ruinous cost.